All right, continuing on here with part two of our video introduction for weeks 5 and 6. So I want to start again. We'll continue with this thread again of persecution from the time of Domitian to the time of Diocletian, and specifically the great persecution of 303 to 313. Again, this begins in 303 with an edict of Diocletian that is renewed by subsequent emperors until the time of Constantine. In 313, Constantine and his colleague, if you like, from the east, Licinius, who reversed this series of edicts in 313 with an edict from Milan. Now, why they did that, of course, is a matter of some complexity, and in part, certainly, Constantine experienced some sort of conversion to the Christian faith. You can read about that more in McCulloch and widely in many other places. In fact, in the fighting that led up to Constantine coming to power, he is reported to have put on the shields of his soldiers the two letters in Greek of Christ's name, the chi and the rho. So in the pattern that we see in all our churches these days, which before Constantine, as McCulloch notes, was not a symbol of the church or of Christian faith, as prominent as it has become in the centuries since. And certainly as the son of a Christian woman, Helena, who had her own piety, deep and rich piety, which involved pilgrimage to Jerusalem and the identification, allegedly, of the true cross, and which effort she helped to promote. Yet here another symbol of Christian faith, the cross, which up until this point was not a prominent symbol of Christian faith at all. What had been really reserved for the ichthus, the fish symbol, now chi rho, and the cross take a more prominent place. But nevertheless, Constantine then, with Licinius, issues an edict in 313, not only because of his conversion to faith, but also a sense perhaps of the way that appeal to this particular deity helped to galvanize his troops and to enable him to have military success. So in other words, there is a political and militaristic reason for Constantine's embrace of this tradition. In any event, in 313, they issue an edict at Milan, and I'm going to read you very briefly a part of the Edict of Milan here. It says, "When we, Constantine Augustus and Licinius Augustus," the great Constantine and the great Licinius, "had happily met at Milan and were conferring about all things which concern the advantage and security of the state, we thought that amongst other things which seemed likely to profit men generally, the reverence paid to the divinity merited our first and chief attention. Our purpose is to grant both to the Christians and to all others full authority to follow whatever worship each man has desired." I'm going to skip here and continue to read one other section here. "No man whatever should be refused complete toleration who has given up his mind either to the cult of the Christians or to the religion which he personally feels best suited to himself, to the end that the supreme divinity, to whose worship we devote ourselves under no compulsion, may continue in all things to grant us his wonted favor and beneficence." Now, this is an interesting statement. There's more to the Edict of Milan, and certainly you can find copies of it on your own with fairly little effort. But in any case, it's an interesting statement that it is the favor of the divinity that they are trying to secure, because just about 150 years or 125 years or so before this, well, more like 140 or so, the Greek philosopher Celsus, who you have a wild card reading from in week 5, argued the exact opposite. Celsus argued strongly against Christianity, that one of the reasons it was a bankrupt faith is that it appeals to a God which, from the time of its Jewish background, is alleged to give military success and to secure his people in some kind of divine favor, some kind of state that would endure. And Celsus points out that this is ridiculous. These people have had a history of not having a secure and lasting state, and certainly that is the case in the 2nd century when Celsus was writing. Certainly that was the case then. So what an absurd thing for Christians to appeal to this same God and suggest that this God could do anything to help give favor to the state. Well, now here you have two emperors making the very opposite claim, saying, in fact, that and later on in the edict they will state that they are hoping to secure that very beneficence of the deity, which has helped them most recently and has brought the state to such a prosperous existence. So it's quite a transformation. And one of the reasons that I lift that up here, as we again as something to think about in your reading and reflection over the next couple of weeks, is that the Christian faith has always had this sort of back and forth interface with the state. But if perhaps it might be characterized in the early centuries of its existence, the church and Rome in particular certainly is evidenced by the book of Revelation. There is a tense existence there. And now with this, the church has got to navigate new territory, so to speak, where Rome is no longer seen perhaps as the agent of the Antichrist, certainly as Rome is depicted in the book of Revelation. Now, Rome could be the agent of God's purposes coming on earth. And so why I say there's always been a tension, I don't want you to think of this as purely a new development, is that, of course, alongside Revelation, and especially Revelation 13, you have Romans 13, which has, of course, a much more favorable view of the state as being appointed by God. That's how Paul speaks of it in Romans 13. So this is not a new element, but it is an important historical development for the way in which Christians are going to think about the role of the state in affecting God's purposes. And some of that reflection will reach a high water mark, so to speak, in the work of Augustine of Hippo, who we're going to talk a little bit more about here in a few minutes, in his work, The City of God, in the early 400s, when Augustine is writing that. But in any case, I'll lift that up for you, and again, your ongoing reading. I just want to make you aware of this dynamic, to think about the way that the history of the church's transition, if you like, from a persecuted church to an imperial church causes it to sort of reframe its narrative regarding the role of the state. Additional things then to be aware of here as we now get into the 300s, coming out of this time of Diocletian persecution, just as we had seen coming out of the period of Decian persecution a half century before. The church is now divided in some of its members between where confessors and lapsed, or another word here that is used, the confessors and the traditores. This is from a Latin word which means to hand over. The traditores are those who handed over the sacred writings of the Christian faith in a time of intense persecution. And I say intense persecution because it is important to note, as McCulloch does, that it's during the Diocletian persecution that nearly half of all records of martyrdom from the early church come from this roughly 10-year period. And so this is a time of intense persecution. And coming out of it, once again, you have church leaders who are rigorous, like Novatian was a half century before, and those who are a little bit more measured in when it comes to reintegrating those who had lapsed into the life of the community. Important here are Donatus, especially. There's Mellitus of Lycopolis out of Egypt, who created a rival clerical hierarchy, created a kind of schismatic church that resisted readmission of the lapsed. A little bit more significantly for the development of the church, though, is Donatus, who was a North African bishop from the city of Carthage, who contended in particular that the sacraments performed by the bishops and priests who had lapsed would not be effective because of their lapsing, because they handed over the teachings. They handed over their scriptures. They gave in this time of intense persecution. I mention that because, again, Augustine, who wrote on a great deal and had a great deal on which to write, also wrote about the Donatists, and you have a wild card reading from a very brief selection from a Donatist bishop and Augustine's response to it. And Augustine is going to introduce the idea that the church is a mixed church. He will work from the parable of the wheat and the tares, the wheat and the weeds, and to suggest that the church is as we experience on earth, a mixed church. And so I commend that to you. What will come out of that, this discussion in the centuries that will follow, is again the question of sacramental effectiveness. What makes the sacraments effective? Is it the purity of the one performing the sacrament, the conviction, the strength of conviction in the face even of persecution? Or is it something else? Is it something resident in the rite itself, and so that when it's rightly performed, it is always effective? Or is it yet, as Luther later, many centuries later, will say that it's not the purity of the one who does the performance, but it is the faith in the one who receives it. Again, there is a discussion forum, wild card reading on this, and I'll commend it to your investigation as you have the chance to look at it. For now, then, I am going to simply pause this. This is a little briefer introductory video, but I want to pause here so that I can record a third video that will shift focus to the Christological developments that are going to take place through the 4th and into the early 5th century, covered nicely by McCulloch, but a little bit, those are a little broader, obviously, in terms of subject matter. So I'm going to pause this now, and we'll record one more video here to introduce weeks 5 and 6.